As it turns out, there are a bevy of logically consistent arguments offered on behalf of God. Take, for example, the first cause proof advanced by Aristotle as refined by Thomas Aquinas. Edward Feser lays out the argument in his book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. The argument goes something like this. First, change exists in the world, but all change is the actualization of a potential for that change. So if something is changing, it's because there was a potential for that change in the thing. No potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it. So that means that all change is caused by something already actual. This means either there is an infinite regress of actualizers, or there is a purely actual actualizer. This is sort of like the old joke about the philosopher and the turtle. The philosopher is asked, what supports the earth? And he says, a turtle. And somebody says, well, what supports the turtle? And he says, another turtle. So what about that one? He says, it's turtles all the way down. The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle. There has to be one prime cause. That cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. So there's one unchanging cause that is purely actual. That is the thing that we call God, and it actualizes all of the other changes.
Now we're talking. The argument from change is a fascinating argument that I think doesn't get nearly enough attention in modern apologetics. Ben serves his view as well by pointing them to Ed Feser's book, which spends a marvelous 51 pages on this Aristotelian argument. Ben went over it quite quickly, so let me try to give you a bit more detail. The first premise is usually accepted as common sense. Change exists. Things change. A hot coffee becomes a cold coffee. A parked car becomes a moving car. The most subscribed atheist skeptic YouTube channel becomes the second most subscribed. But change as a concept is a bit more paradoxical than it may seem at first. Think about it. What is change? Well, according to Parmenides, a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, change is actually impossible. When things appear to change, it can only be that, an appearance, an illusion. In reality, nothing ever actually changes at all. Okay, why on earth would he think this? Well, for change to occur, says Parmenides, there needs to be something that at one point doesn't exist and then comes into existence. Feser imagines a hot cup of coffee. The cold coffee, which it will eventually become, doesn't exist yet. It's not there. It's not anywhere. And if something doesn't exist, it's nothing. So for the coffee to become cold, something, that is the cold coffee, must come from what is currently nothing. But Parmenides draws our attention to one of philosophy's most famous observations. Ex nihilo nihil fit. Nothing comes from nothing. Or to put it in more familiar terms, you can't get something from nothing. From nothing, nothing can come. And so if change involves something coming from nothing, then change can't actually exist and must be some kind of illusion. Or take an example from The Philosopher, a wonderful channel, by the way. My skin is white, but if I sit out in the sun, it will become red. This change in my skin color requires that redness, which currently doesn't exist, comes into existence. What is nothing must become something. But if something coming from nothing is impossible, then change must therefore be impossible too. Pretty weird, right? Well, not according to a small-time thinker from Steigera you may have heard of, called Aristotle, who argues, contrary to Parmenides, that change doesn't involve something coming from nothing, but rather something coming from potential, which is not quite the same thing as nothing. Ed Feser imagines, once again, the hot coffee. Now, the future coldness of the coffee is not actually present right now, but it is potentially present, in that the hot coffee currently has, right now, the potential to become cold. The parked car has the potential to move forward. My channel has the potential to overtake Drew's once more, or so I like to think. Now, you may say that this is just wordplay. Sure, the coffee has the potential to become cold, but the coldness still doesn't exist. Well, sure, but consider something else that doesn't exist, like a chicken. This coffee is not cold, and it's also not a chicken. But these seem importantly different, since the coffee seems to have the potential to become cold, but it doesn't have the potential to become a chicken. The coldness and the chicken both don't exist, but the coldness seems to not exist in a different kind of way, a more substantial kind of way, because although it's not actually present, it is potentially present in a way that the chicken is not. So sure, if this hot coffee were to turn into a chicken, that would seem to be like something coming from nothing. But if the hot coffee turns into a cold coffee, it seems to be something coming from potential, which is not quite nothing, at least not in the same way as the chicken is. So, for Aristotle, change is not something coming from nothing, but rather the actualization of potential. Actualization here just means something potential becoming actual, the potentially cold coffee becoming an actually cold coffee. So the reason why this coffee can't change into a chicken is because change is the actualization of potential, and this coffee doesn't have the potential to become a chicken. So potential is a real thing that exists of objects like my coffee that's distinct from nothing at all. At least that's what Aristotle would have us believe. So the first premise of the argument that Ben's presenting is that change exists. And we might have thought from Parmenides' paradox that change can't actually exist. But maybe this paradox fails, because change doesn't actually require something to come from nothing, as Parmenides thought, because potential isn't nothing. It's a real property of my coffee, which just needs to be actualized. And that actualization of the real potential that my coffee has to become cold is what we call change. So the argument continues, change requires a changer. Potential doesn't just spontaneously actualize. It has to be actualized by something else. The potential coldness of the coffee is actualized by the coldness of the room. The potential million subscribers on this YouTube channel is actualized by you smashing that subscribe button. And don't forget the notification bell. I also have a Patreon. But crucially, only something that's already actual can actualize something else. The potential coldness of my coffee can't be actualized by, say, a really hot room that has the potential to be cold. The room has to be actually cold in order to actualize the coldness of the coffee. But this is the beginning of a regress. Why? Well, because the coldness of the coffee is actualized by the coldness of the room. But the hot room becoming a cold room is itself the actualization of potential, as is the existence of the room in the first place, since at one point this room never existed, it only potentially existed. And so the room itself required an actualizer, and whatever actualized the room requires its own actualizer, and so on and so forth. Now, if this chain goes on infinitely, we seem to have a problem, as Ben argues.
This is sort of like the old joke about the philosopher and the turtle. The philosopher is asked, what supports the earth? And he says, a turtle. And somebody says, well, what supports the turtle? And he says, another turtle. So what about that one? He says, it's turtles all the way down. The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle. There has to be one prime cause. That cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. So there's one unchanging cause that is purely actual. That is the thing that we call God, and it actualizes all of the other changes.
So as you can see, this is a kind of first cause argument that doesn't establish much beyond the existence of some fundamental, purely actual cause at the basis of all other actual things. Now, this might not sound like God yet to you, but a purely actual cause that sustains and actualizes everything that exists is pretty difficult to believe in and call yourself an atheist. Okay, that was maybe a bit long, but I hope you're still with me. I think it was worth really spelling out this argument. If any of the previous doesn't make sense, or you're confused about it, you can read Ed Feser's book, or simply Google the argument from change for more information. Now I want to tell you some issues that I have with it. The first problem that I have with this is treating potential as if it's a real quality of an object. To avoid thinking of change as something coming from nothing, we imagine that this hot coffee really has this thing, this potential to become cold. Potential is thought of as a real property of my coffee.
So if something is changing, it's because there was a potential for that change in the thing.
But consider this. My coffee has the potential to be lots of things. In fact, it seems to have the potential to be an infinite number of things. For example, My coffee is currently around 70 degrees Celsius, and it has the potential to cool down to 60 degrees Celsius. It also has the potential to be exactly 60.1 degrees. It has the potential to be 60.11 degrees. It has the potential to be 60.111 degrees, and so on, ad infinitum. Now, a great deal of religious philosophers and non-religious philosophers believe that actual infinites can't exist. For example, this is the basis of William Lane Craig's version of the Kalam cosmological argument. If an infinite number of things really exists, it leads to all kinds of paradoxes, perhaps most famously the paradox of Hilbert's Hotel.
The way in which Ghazali shows the impossibility of an actually infinite number of things is by imagining what it would be like if such a collection could exist, and then drawing out the absurd consequences from it.
More information is in the description. I'll link my podcast episode with William Lane Craig, one of my favorites to date, in which we talk about this in some detail. Now, it's important to distinguish between actual infinites and potential infinites. Actual infinites would be some kind of actually infinite number of things that exists all at once, whereas potential infinites are things which tend towards infinity without ever actually getting there. For example, I can halve the space between my hands, and I can halve it again, and I can halve it again, and I can halve it again, and I can keep going on ad infinitum. But because this is a process that tends towards infinity, but never actually gets there, there's no paradoxes involved. Now, if I keep on adding decimal points to the temperature of my coffee, as I did a moment ago, it may seem like we're dealing with a potential infinite that continually tends towards infinity, but never actually gets there. But remember, in order to avoid Parmenides' objections, we needed to say that all of the potential properties of this coffee are potential properties that are real, that it actually has right now. It actually has these properties, these potential properties, because otherwise, if they didn't exist, if they weren't real, they'd be nothing, and then we'd run into Parmenides' objection. But that means all of these potential temperatures that my coffee could be are potentially present in the coffee all at once, right now. This isn't something tending towards infinity as I count it out. These things are thought of as actually existing as potential properties of my coffee right now. So if we have to think of a potential property as a real thing in order to avoid something coming from nothing, then we would be positing that this coffee has an actually infinite number of properties which really exist, which seems to be impossible. A second problem is one that was raised by the atheist philosopher Graham Oppy while he was discussing this very argument with Ed Feser himself, something that you can watch on the Capturing Christianity YouTube channel. Oppy simply grants that change is the actualization of potential, but he points out that the reverse is not true. Not all actualization of potential is change. He provides the example of a chair, like the chair that I'm sat on right now. Now, this chair is yellow. This chair has the potential to become blue, say, if somebody were to reupholster it. But it also seems to have the potential to remain yellow. That is, things that are actual seem to have the potential to simply remain as they are. If they don't have this potential, then they wouldn't be able to remain as they are, and so they would stop existing. And therefore, actual things will always have at least one kind of potential, which is the potential to remain as they are. But now listen to what Ben correctly says about the first cause established by the argument from change.
There has to be one prime cause. That cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. So there's one unchanging cause that is purely actual.
The God that Ben is talking about has to be something that has no potential whatsoever. But as I've just argued, unless God is about to stop existing, he must have at least one kind of potential, which is the potential to remain as he is, to remain in existence. So the purely actual God with no potential that Ben thinks he's proven may not actually be able to exist at all. Finally, my third objection is that the argument from change may only work on an A theory of time. The A theory of time posits that the present is all that exists. The past and the future, in other words, don't exist. There's just the present. The B theory of time, on the other hand, posits that the past and the future both exist just like the present does, and that they all exist in one big time block. It can be a little bit weird to get your head around, but On the B theory of time, it's often suggested that objects, as well as having 3 spatial dimensions, also have a 4th temporal dimension that stretches across this time block. Of course, we're only able to see one point of this dimension, but the past cup and the future cup both exist just like the present one does. The only thing that makes this part of the cup, the present cup, is that the person calling it the present cup occupies the same place on the time block as this particular part of the cup. So on this view, you are, right now, looking at a different part of the cup than you were a moment ago, because the cup has a real, unobservable, but real dimension that stretches through time, and what you think of as the present cup and the future cup are actually just different parts of this same cup along that temporal dimension. Thus, the potential cup, the cold cup, and the actual cup, the hot cup, are actually just the same cup, and these words merely describe different points along this temporal dimension. But all of these points exist, all in the same way, and if you were able to step outside of the time block, you'd see them all at once. If this is the case, then calling something potential simply because it exists at a different point on the time block to me, and actual when it exists at the same point, would be like me calling the coffee potential because it was in a different room in the house where I can't see it, and actual when it happens to be in front of me. This is a misleading description of what's actually going on. So if the potential coffee and the actual coffee are actually both just different parts of the same coffee that you could see as one big block if you were outside of time, then the distinction between potential and actual is no longer a property of the coffee, but a property of the observer and which point of the coffee's temporal dimension they happen to be looking at. Now, if this is the case, if this is an accurate description of reality, then if we were to look from outside of time, we'd see that there's no such thing as real change, because the past, the present, and the future cup would all simply exist all at once in front of us on this time block. For what it's worth, Ed Feser actually discusses this very objection, and specifically the view that Einstein's relativity theory points to a B theory rather than an A theory of time. So there are 3 objections to Ben's argument to consider. First, the problem of an actually infinite number of potential properties, if potential properties are real things that are predicated of an object. Secondly, the problem of the purely actual actualizer, in fact, at least having one kind of potential, the potential to remain as it is. And thirdly, the problems raised for the argument by adopting a B theory of time, making change itself something of an illusion. It is also worth briefly noting that so far I've basically just agreed to Ben's earlier claim that there just can't be an infinite regress of potential things being actualized.
The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle.
I'm inclined to think that it would be really weird if there were such an infinite regress, but Aristotle himself actually took this view. Of course, to believe as he did in an infinite temporal regress requires belief in an infinite past, which has its problems and paradoxes. And Feser's discussion of an atemporal hierarchical chain of causation seem like they can't actually be infinite, for compelling reasons that he discusses in the book. But of course, if there is an infinite regress of actualization of potential, this would count as a 4th objection to the argument. It's just not one that I would want to defend. Now, as I've already said, I think that the argument from change is brilliant and fascinating and compelling. Sure, I have objections that I've just spoken about, but these might be easily answered, for all I know, by a philosopher of someone like Ed Feser's caliber. But even if my objections can be answered, it seems to me that Ben's suggestion that atheism is a delusion because of the argument from change, among other things, is, shall we say, hyperbolic at best.